The courtroom is packed. Tension was thick, and I knew this was just the beginning. The room smelled of stale coffee and faint anxiety, the air thick with anticipation. I sat in the back row, clutching my purse tightly in my lap. My heart raced, and the knot in my stomach twisted with every passing second. This wasn't how I had imagined things would unfold. It wasn't how I had hoped my daughter's life would turn out. That here I was, in the middle of a divorce hearing that had already become far too public, far too personal. And sitting at the front, where he should have been a stranger to me, was the man who had been my son-in-law for over 7 years. Nate, how had we come to this? How had this young man, once full of promise and hope, turned into the very person who had nearly destroyed my daughter Claire? The truth was hard to swallow, but there it was. The man I had once thought of as part of our family had shown his true colors: cruelty, manipulation, and lies. For years, I had watched as he chipped away at Claire, stripping her of her confidence, her happiness, piece by piece. And now, in this courtroom, I was about to witness the fallout. Claire, sitting beside her lawyer, didn't even look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, her fingers playing with the edge of her sleeve. It was as though she had already detached herself from this moment, resigned to the fact that this chapter of her life was over. I wanted to comfort her, to take her hand and reassure her that everything would be all right. But the truth was, nothing would ever truly be all right again. Not while Nate was still out there, still trying to play the victim. I had always known that Nate wasn't the man he appeared to be. He had been charming, polite, and respectful, at least at first. He had come from a good family, had a decent job, and had seemed like the perfect match for Claire. But as time went on, things began to change. Slowly at first, like the steady drip of a leaky tap, and then more rapidly as the years passed. He started controlling the finances, telling Claire she didn't need to work as much, making excuses for why they couldn't go on family holidays. He even started isolating her from us, her family. I remember the first time I noticed something wasn't right. It was at a family gathering, one of those rare occasions where all of us were together. Claire had been quieter than usual, but I hadn't thought much of it. That was until Nate had snapped at her in front of everyone, his voice raised in anger as he told her she was being too sensitive. I had tried to brush it off as a momentary lapse in judgment, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Over the following months, I watched as Claire became more withdrawn, her confidence diminishing with each passing day. She stopped calling me as often, stopped visiting. I thought it was just a phase, but it wasn't. It was the slow, steady tightening of the noose as the divorce proceedings began. I thought back to all the signs I had missed: the late nights at work, the lies about finances, the way he manipulated her emotions. But it wasn't until Claire had finally broken down and confided in me that I learned the full extent of Nate's betrayal. He had been hiding credit card debt, making secret purchases behind her back. And worst of all, he had been gaslighting her, making her believe she was the one at fault for every argument. He had convinced her that everything was her fault, and she had believed him. Now, as I sat in that courtroom, I couldn't help but feel a rush of anger. How dare he stand there, acting like the victim? How dare he try to justify everything he had done to my daughter with a few rehearsed words of regret? Nate's lawyer had just finished his opening statement, and the room fell silent. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression, nodded for Nate to speak. My breath caught in my throat as he stood up. He was a tall man, his shoulders broad, but now he seemed smaller, somehow deflated. He cleared his throat before speaking, his voice faltering as he said, "I know I've made mistakes, and I don't expect anyone to forgive me. But I'm sorry. I never meant for things to get this bad. I never meant to hurt Claire. His eyes were filled with what seemed to be genuine regret, but I couldn't bring myself to believe him. His apology wasn't for Claire, it was for himself. He had destroyed her trust, taken away her self-worth, and now, when everything was falling apart, he wanted to take the easy way out. He wanted forgiveness, but it wasn't something he deserved. The judge asked him to continue, but I could already see the cracks in his story. His words didn't match his actions. No amount of remorse could fix the damage he had done. As he spoke, my mind raced through all the times I had tried to warn Claire. All the times I had hoped she would leave him before it was too late. Nate was begging now. His voice had cracked, and his hands trembled as he clutched the edge of the witness stand. "I was wrong," he repeated, his face pale. "I was wrong, and I'll do anything to make it right." But it was too late. No apology, no tears, no plea for forgiveness would undo the years of torment he had put her through. The room held its breath as Nate's apology hung in the air, like a fragile thread that threatened to snap at any moment. He had placed himself in the spotlight, hoping that his confession, his tearful plea for forgiveness, would somehow soften the harsh reality of his actions. But as the judge continued to listen to his words, I could feel something shift within me. I had spent so many months, so many years, watching my daughter suffer at his hands, and now he wanted forgiveness as though it could erase everything. I could almost feel Claire's eyes on me, though she hadn't spoken since the beginning of the session. She was processing, digesting, waiting for the next move. But I knew deep down that this wasn't going to end well for him. Not with the evidence we had. I glanced at her, sitting still beside her attorney, her face drawn but determined. She wasn't going to let him walk out of here with a free pass. Not after everything he'd done. She was stronger now than I had ever seen her, and I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride for her. She had finally found her voice again, and it was louder now than any apology Nate could offer. As the judge leaned forward, her expression unreadable, I couldn't help but feel that the moment had passed. Nate had made his case, but the room wasn't moved. His words seemed hollow now, like an actor playing a part he had rehearsed too many times. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with short grey hair and sharp eyes, adjusted her glasses before turning her gaze back to Nate. "Mr. Grayson," she began, her voice firm but calm, "you've expressed your remorse, but remorse does not undo the damage caused. You have spent years manipulating your wife, controlling her finances, isolating her from her family, and perhaps most damaging of all, stripping her of her self-worth." Her words were like a dagger in the quiet room, and I could feel the shift as everyone's attention turned sharply toward Nate. His face flushed, and for the first time, the confident veneer he had worn for so long cracked. I could see the panic in his eyes as the judge laid out the extent of his actions. She continued, "You've shown no regard for the harm you've done, and now you stand here, hoping that a few words can change the truth of your actions. It's too little, too late." I held my breath as the weight of her words settled over the courtroom. For all his pleas, for all his attempts to sway the room, there was no escaping the truth of what he had done to Claire. It was all laid out, and it was too late for him to hide behind excuses anymore. But what really struck me, what broke my heart more than anything, was the look on Claire's face. She was still almost completely motionless, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't react to the judge's words, but I could see the tightness in her jaw, the way her chest rose and fell with controlled breaths. She was fighting not to let the emotion get to her, but I knew it had to be overwhelming. To hear someone lay out, in such cold detail, how her life had been systematically torn apart by the man who had once promised to protect her, couldn't be easy. I wanted to rush to her side, to hold her, but I knew better than that. This was her battle now, She had fought so hard to get to this point, and she was determined to face it on her own. I respected that more than anything. But as I sat there, I couldn't stop thinking about all the things Nate had taken from her. Her self-esteem, her dreams, her trust in people. All of it had been quietly chipped away over the years, piece by piece. And now, as he stood there, pretending to be remorseful, pretending to care, I wanted nothing more than to expose him for the coward he truly was. The judge was continuing, but her words were fading into the background as my mind raced. This case will not be resolved by regret alone. Mr. Grayson, she said, the evidence presented here speaks for itself. There will be consequences. For the emotional abuse, for the financial fraud, for the years you've manipulated and gaslighted your wife. You will not be let off lightly. Nate's attorney jumped in at this point, attempting to diffuse the tension, but it was clear the case was slipping from his grasp. Your Honor, we understand the gravity of the situation, but Mr. Grayson has shown genuine remorse. He's willing to pay reparations and work to rebuild his relationship with his wife. The words felt almost laughable. A man who had spent years breaking someone down wasn't going to rebuild anything by writing a check. My blood boiled at the mere suggestion. Claire wasn't some pawn to be repaired with money or superficial promises. She was a personal woman who had suffered immeasurably at the hands of this man, and she deserved far more than his empty words. I could feel the tension rising in the room, and I could see Nate shifting nervously, unable to meet the judge's unflinching gaze. His once calm facade was breaking, the mask slipping away. He knew, deep down, that he was running out of chances. The truth was catching up with him, and for all the times he had manipulated the narrative, for all the times he had convinced Claire and me that he was a victim, now it was his turn to face the consequences. The judge's gavel rang out sharply, and the room fell silent. This court will reconvene tomorrow to hear further testimony, she declared. In the meantime, Mr. Grayson, I suggest you reflect on the gravity of your actions. This is not just a matter of financial restitution. It is a matter of integrity and accountability. As the gavel hit the table, Nate stood frozen, his eyes wide, his hands still trembling. The weight of his own deceit was finally settling on his shoulders. It was no longer a game, and he was no longer in control. The courtroom had quieted after the judge's ruling, but I could feel the tension building in the air. People shifted in their seats, the murmurs of the gallery barely audible against the backdrop of the thick silence. I watched as Nate stood, his lawyer whispering to him urgently. But he wasn't listening. His eyes, though filled with panic, kept darting towards Claire, as if expecting her to show any sign of weakness, any indication that his apology, however empty, might still reach her. But Claire wasn't looking at him. She was still, her back straight as though she had hardened herself to the moment, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her expression was unreadable, but I could see the tightness in her jaw, the slight tension in her shoulders. I could almost feel the storm brewing inside her, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she would finally let the floodgates open. It had been a long time coming, this moment. She had spent years suffering in silence, too afraid to speak out, too afraid of what might happen if she did. But she had already made the hardest decision of her life. She was divorcing Nate, no matter the consequences. And now, with everything on the line, she was about to speak her truth. The judge glanced at Claire, her voice calm but commanding as she addressed her. "Mrs. Thornton," she said, "would you like to present your testimony?" I saw Claire take a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as if gathering the strength to speak. She nodded slowly, then stood up, walking toward the witness stand with a calmness that belied the storm inside her. As she passed me, I reached out instinctively to touch her arm. Her gaze met mine for a brief moment, just long enough to convey everything she wasn't saying out loud. In that single glance, I saw the fear, the hurt, and the strength. She was ready. As she took the stand, I found my breath catching in my throat. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment I had feared for so long. The moment that would expose everything Nate had done. Everything he had hidden from the world. But it was also the moment I had been praying for. The moment my daughter would finally get the chance to reclaim her life. To take back the years that Nate had stolen from her. The judge's voice broke through my thoughts. "Please, Mrs. Thornton, tell us your side of the story." Claire's voice was steady when she spoke, though there was a slight tremor in it that betrayed the emotional toll this was taking on her. "It's been hard for me," she began, her eyes fixed on the judge, "to stand up here and tell you everything. For years, I thought I was just overreacting. I thought I was the problem. Nate would tell me that I was too sensitive, that I was too needy, that I didn't understand him. He made me feel like I was the one who was always wrong." Her words were soft, but they carried weight. I could hear the bitterness in her tone, the years of frustration and hurt finally spilling out. I could see the faint trace of tears at the corner of her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "Not yet. I had no idea how much control he had over me," she continued, her gaze flicking briefly to Nate. "He told me that I didn't need to worry about money, that he would take care of everything. But then I found out that he had been racking up credit card debt behind my back, thousands of dollars. And when I confronted him, he told me it was my fault, that I was irresponsible with money, that I didn't understand how things worked." I could hear the shift in her voice now, the crack of pain that came from reliving those moments. I wanted to reach out to her, to remind her how far she had come. But I knew she had to do this on her own. "The truth is, he had a plan," Claire said, her eyes never leaving Nate. "He wanted me to believe that I was worthless, that I couldn't handle anything on my own. And for a long time, I believed him. He made me think that I couldn't trust anyone, not even my own family. He isolated me. He made me feel like I was crazy for questioning him. But I wasn't crazy. He was." Her words struck like a thunderclap, and the courtroom grew deathly silent. I could see the color drain from Nate's face, his expression faltering as the reality of her testimony hit him. For the first time, he looked genuinely afraid. I could feel the weight of his guilt pressing down on him, but I knew it wasn't enough. It was too late for him to escape what he had done. I stayed with him because I thought it was the right thing to do. "I thought I could fix him," Claire continued, her voice soft but resolute. "But the truth is, I was never going to fix him. He didn't want to change. He didn't want to save our marriage. He just wanted to control me." The silence in the room was palpable now. Nate didn't speak, didn't even look at her. He sat there, ashen-faced, unable to hide the guilt that was now so clearly written on his face. Claire's words had shattered the facade he had so carefully built over the years. He was exposed, and there was no turning back. As Claire finished speaking, the judge nodded thoughtfully, her expression hardening. "Thank you, Mrs. Thornton. Your testimony has been heard." I could see Claire's shoulders slump slightly, the weight of her words lifting off her chest. She had done it. She had told the truth. And there was no going back now. But I knew the battle wasn't over. The truth was on the table, but Nate still had one more card to play. And I was certain that he wouldn't go down without a fight. The gavel had barely fallen before the courtroom erupted into low murmurs. My daughter had spoken her truth, and the air had shifted. But the battle wasn't over, far from it. Nate, though visibly shaken, hadn't completely lost his composure. I could see him trying to gather his thoughts, his lawyer whispering in his ear, probably urging him to stay calm, to keep up the facade. But nothing could stop the wheels of justice now. as Claire sat back down beside me. Her eyes met mine for the briefest of moments. There was a flicker of something in them, relief, certainly, but also resolve. She had opened the floodgates, and now the whole world could see the truth. There was no going back for her, and she wasn't about to let Nate worm his way out of this. The judge, still poised and unyielding, shifted her attention to Nate. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice a sharp contrast to the tenderness with which she had addressed Claire. "You've heard your wife's testimony. You've heard the evidence. Do you have anything to add before we proceed?" Nate stood up slowly, his face now pale, his earlier bravado completely gone. He wasn't the confident man I had once thought he was. He was just a man exposed, backed into a corner, desperate. I saw his hands tremble as he adjusted his tie, a small but telling sign of how rattled he was. For a moment it seemed like he might collapse under the pressure. But then he straightened his back and cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. I just want to say that I am deeply sorry for what has happened," he began, his voice unsteady. "I never intended for things to go this far. I made mistakes, yes, but the reality is, Claire has her own part to play in this. She's not blameless." There it was, the moment I had feared. His deflection, the same old manipulation he had used for years. He was trying to shift the blame back onto Claire, painting her as the one at fault. His words were sharp, cutting into the air like knives. "She's the one who pushed me away," he continued, his eyes scanning the room, seeking sympathy. "She stopped being the woman I married. She wasn't the same person anymore." I could feel my blood boiling. How dare he? How dare he stand there and lie, once again, to save himself? This wasn't about the marriage. It was about power. Nate wanted to control everything, and he wanted to make sure he was still seen as the victim. It was all a performance, a ploy to avoid taking full responsibility for the destruction he had caused. But this time, the room wasn't buying it. The judge didn't flinch. "Mr. Grayson, this is not the place to discuss blame shifting. This court is here to determine the facts based on evidence. If you have no more relevant testimony, I suggest we proceed." Nate stood frozen, his words falling flat in the face of the judge's cold dismissal. He hesitated for a long moment, like he was searching for a way out, a loophole that could save him. But there was no escape. Claire's testimony had shattered his defenses, and now all that remained was his own guilt. The judge then turned to Claire, her eyes softening just slightly as she addressed her. "Mrs. Thornton, we will now proceed with the financial settlement." She glanced at the attorneys, nodding for them to begin. "But I must ask, are you prepared to make your request for financial compensation today, or would you prefer to postpone?" Claire was silent for a moment, as if considering the offer. I could see the weight of the decision in her eyes. She had already endured so much. And yet, as she glanced toward Nate for the first time since her testimony, I saw something shift in her demeanor, something stronger, more resolute. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for justice. "No," Claire said, her voice cutting through the room with a surprising clarity. "I'm ready. We're going to settle everything today." She was calm now, more composed than I had ever seen her. But there was an undeniable strength in the way she spoke, the way her words resonated in the room. She was no longer the quiet, reserved woman she once had been, walking on eggshells around Nate. No, this was a woman who had found her power, her voice, and she wasn't going to let anyone silence her again. As her attorney began outlining the terms of the settlement, I watched as Nate's face slowly drained of color. The terms were more than fair. They weren't just about the assets. They were about accountability. The financial settlement demanded by Claire was significant, But more importantly, it was a reflection of the emotional damage Nate had caused. She wasn't asking for revenge, but she was making sure he understood that actions had consequences. But what struck me the most was the look on Nate's face. He wasn't just losing money, he was losing control. The carefully constructed image of himself as the successful, perfect husband was crumbling. And no amount of deflection, no amount of remorse, could put it back together. At the end of the day, the judge rendered her decision quickly. The terms of the settlement will be enacted immediately. Mr. Grayson, you will be required to pay the stipulated amount within 30 days. In addition, you will have no further legal or financial claims against Mrs. Thornton. This case is concluded. Nate stood in stunned silence. The weight of the judgment was finally sinking in, and I could see the panic in his eyes as he realized there was no escaping the consequences anymore. For the first time, he wasn't in control, and it felt like a long overdue justice. But Claire wasn't finished. As she stood up to leave, she turned toward Nate, her gaze unwavering. "You should have left when you had the chance," she said, her voice steady but full of quiet resolve. "Because now you've lost everything." With that, she walked out of the courtroom, head held high. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like my daughter had taken back her life. The courtroom doors closed behind us with a sharp bang. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the weight of the day began to sink in. We stood there for a moment, Claire and I, on the threshold of something monumental. It wasn't just the end of the trial, it was the end of a chapter in our lives that had been too painful to bear for far too long. I looked at her, at my daughter who had finally found her voice, who had fought for herself in a way I hadn't thought possible. I reached out, wrapping my arm around her shoulders as we stepped into the quiet hallway. For a moment, we said nothing, simply absorbing the magnitude of what had just occurred. But I could feel the energy around us shifting, changing. The world outside this courtroom was different now, our lives, different. But while we were standing here, trying to absorb it all, Nate wasn't done yet. He wasn't just going to accept the consequences of his actions. His pride wouldn't allow it. The next few days were a blur of legal paperwork and phone calls from the courthouse. But Nate's actions were far from subtle. He began calling Claire's lawyer repeatedly, insisting that the settlement terms were unfair, that he wasn't in a position to pay the full amount immediately. He tried to argue that the ruling had been based on incomplete information, that the emotional damages were exaggerated. It was the same old playbook, the same manipulative tactics. But now it was clear to everyone that no one was buying it. Could almost feel the panic in him as his calls became more desperate. But it wasn't just his financial situation that was crumbling. No, it was his entire sense of control. He had always been the one pulling the strings, dictating the terms of the relationship. But now, with everything exposed, with the truth finally out in the open, he was nothing. Just a man, broken and desperate to hold on to whatever shred of dignity he had left. But Claire wasn't having it. She had reached a point where no amount of pleading or manipulation would work. She had already given him more than enough chances to make things right. And now he was reaping the consequences. His calls became increasingly frantic. And that's when I knew he was trying to find a way to escape the settlement, to avoid paying the price for everything he had done. I had warned Claire that Nate wouldn't just walk away quietly. This was a man who had built his entire life on lies, on deceit, and he wasn't about to let that go without a fight. But this time, it wasn't just Claire who was standing her ground. It was me too. I had seen enough of his games, enough of his manipulation. When Nate reached out to me directly, I was ready. His voice was strained, like he knew he was on the edge of losing everything. "Look, I know you're angry," he said, his tone more pleading than I had ever heard it. But this isn't fair. You know, this isn't how things should end. I made mistakes, yes, but I'm willing to work things out. I'll pay whatever you want. Just let me try to fix things. Fix things? After everything he had done? I felt a surge of disgust. You've had your chance, Nate, I said firmly, my voice steady. You've done enough damage. This isn't about fixing anything. It's about paying for the harm you've caused. You don't get to walk away from the wreckage you've created. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear his breathing, slow and labored, as though he were trying to figure out how to spin this in his favor. I can't pay it all at once, he said finally, desperation creeping into his voice. I need time. I'll sell some things, I'll get the money. Just give me some time. But there was no more time for him. I wasn't interested in his excuses anymore. Claire wasn't interested. The judge had spoken. The settlement had been finalized. And Nate had no choice but to deal with the consequences. I hung up the phone without another word, feeling a sense of finality wash over me. The matter was done. Nate had made his bed, and now he was going to lie in it. But just when I thought it was over, I received a call that would turn everything upside down. Claire's attorney had just gotten wind of something that made my blood run cold. Nate had filed for bankruptcy. It was his last-ditch effort to avoid paying the settlement. He had hoped that by declaring bankruptcy, he could void the financial obligations. He had hoped that the court would see him as a man unable to pay and grant him some reprieve. But what he hadn't counted on was that his manipulation would only make things worse. Bankruptcy wasn't the shield he thought it was. It wasn't a way out. It was a way for the court to dig deeper into his finances, to examine everything he had been hiding. And with the way he had manipulated Claire's finances throughout their marriage, there was no way he could escape the scrutiny. Claire had every right to be angry. But what struck me most was the calm in her voice when she heard the news. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't shaking with rage or frustration. She was steady, resolute. She had already come to terms with the fact that Nate would fight. But now it was clear that his actions were only digging his own grave deeper. I'm not backing down, Claire said to me as we discussed the bankruptcy. This isn't about money anymore. It's about holding him accountable for what he's done. He's not getting away with this. It wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a battle of wills. And Nate had no idea who he was really up against. The next few weeks felt like a slow march toward the inevitable. The news of Nate's bankruptcy filing spread like wildfire, and it became clear that he was only digging himself into a deeper hole. He had hoped that by declaring bankruptcy, he could absolve himself of the financial settlement. He thought the court would see him as a victim of his circumstances, a man who had simply fallen on hard times. But what he hadn't anticipated was how the legal system would respond to his attempt to manipulate the situation. Claire's attorney, a calm and methodical woman named Rebecca, was already working on countering Nate's bankruptcy move. Bankruptcy won't erase what he's done, she assured us during one of our meetings. It only complicates matters for him. We can still pursue the settlement, and frankly, the court is likely to be more inclined to enforce it now, given his attempt to evade responsibility. But there was something more pressing that Rebecca revealed to us that day, something that made my heart sink. I've been looking into Nate's finances more closely, she said, and it seems he's been hiding assets. There are offshore accounts, trust funds he hasn't disclosed. It's all coming to light now, and it's going to backfire on him. The realization hit me like a freight train. Nate had thought he could play the system-used bankruptcy as a shield to avoid the consequences of his actions. But now, the very thing he had hoped would help him escape was the one thing that would expose him for the fraud he truly was. The legal team began to assemble the evidence, compiling everything they could find about Nate's hidden wealth. They would have him cornered in no time. It was just a matter of bringing it all to light. That Nate wasn't just fighting the legal system. He was fighting Claire. And he was fighting me now. He had made it personal. I could see his desperation in the way he kept calling. His voice getting more frantic with each message he left. He didn't have a leg to stand on anymore, and he knew it. But like a cornered animal, he was lashing out in every direction, hoping that something would give him the escape he so desperately craved. It was the day after Rebecca had told us about the hidden assets that I got another call from Nate. I didn't even bother to let him speak. I wasn't interested in his apologies or excuses anymore. "What do you want, Nate?" I said sharply, cutting him off before he could go into his usual spiel about needing time, needing a second chance. His voice was quiet, almost trembling. "I just need you to listen," he said. His words rushed. "You don't understand. I'm in a terrible position here. I can't lose everything. Please, just give me some time. I can pay you back, just give me a few months." I let out a slow breath. "You think this is about money? This isn't about money. This is about everything you've done. About the years you've wasted, the lies, the manipulation. You didn't care about Claire. You never did. You just wanted control." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him shifting in his seat, his voice cracking as he spoke again. "I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. Please just let me fix it." I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to keep my emotions in check. You don't get to fix it. You don't get to undo what you've done. You've had plenty of chances and you threw them all away. Before I could hang up, he added, almost pleading, "What if I tell you the truth? What if I tell you everything about the trust funds, the offshore accounts? I can give you everything. It's all there. I've been hiding it. But I'll come clean. I'll give it to you. Just give me time. Just give me one last chance." A part of me wanted to laugh at the irony of it all. The man who had spent years deceiving Claire, who had used her love and trust for his own benefit, was now offering to come clean. He was offering the truth, but only because it suited his needs. Only because the walls were closing in on him, and he had nowhere left to run. "No, Nate," I said, my voice unwavering. "You don't get to make demands anymore. You don't get to dictate the terms. You've already lost." I hung up before he could say anything else, feeling a sense of finality wash over me. It wasn't just the end of this chapter. It was the end of any hope Nate had of walking away unscathed. He had made his final play, and it was too little, too late. Claire was strong, but this was going to be a hard pill for her to swallow. To know that he had hidden so much, that his entire life had been a lie, it would hurt her. But I knew, deep down, she was ready for it. She had already proven that she wasn't going to let him control her anymore. She was done with him. The court case that followed was brutal. The evidence of Nate's hidden assets was presented in full, and his bankruptcy claims were promptly dismissed. The judge didn't just see through his charade, she saw him for what he truly was. A man who had used the system, used his wife, and used his family for his own gain. And now, there was no way out. The final ruling came down hard. Nate was ordered to pay the full amount of the settlement, along with legal fees and a substantial penalty for his attempts to defraud the court. He had lost everything, and it was his own doing. But for Claire, it was more than just about the money. It was about the justice she had fought for, about reclaiming her life. Piece by piece. The days following the court's final ruling were like a dream where the nightmare we had been living for so long had finally ended. For Claire, the relief was palpable. You could see it in the way she carried herself, in the way she began to smile again. But the relief was also tempered by the knowledge that this battle had come at a heavy cost. Not just the financial strain or the emotional toll, but the realization that the man she had once loved, the man she had trusted, had been lying to her for years. That betrayal, though legally addressed, would take longer to heal. But she was healing, and that was the most important thing. Nate, on the other hand, had no such luxury. His life began to crumble before his very eyes. It wasn't just the financial consequences of the judgment or the bankruptcy that plagued him. His reputation, which he had worked so hard to cultivate, was now in tatters. Word spread quickly about his deception, about the offshore accounts and the hidden assets. And soon enough, the media caught wind of his fall from grace. Claire and I had made a conscious decision not to engage with the media, that Nate had no such control over the narrative. As stories about his bankruptcy and his fraudulent schemes hit the news, his carefully crafted image as a successful businessman shattered. Articles painted him as a manipulative con artist who had used his marriage as a front for his greed. Public sympathy, once something he had relied on so heavily, quickly evaporated. It was almost surreal to watch him, the once confident man who had tried to belittle Claire at every turn, now struggling to keep his head above water. I saw it in the news reports, in the whispers among acquaintances who had once admired him. Nate Grayson, the man who had been the perfect husband on the outside, was revealed as a fraud. I couldn't say I felt sorry for him, not after everything he had done to Claire. But a part of me couldn't help but wonder how he was going to face the real consequences now. It wasn't just the legal ramifications. It wasn't just the financial devastation. It was the fact that, after everything, he had no one left. The people who had once supported him, who had once been swayed by his charm, were now turning their backs. The only person who could have helped him, who might have given him a chance to redeem himself, was Claire. But Claire had already made her decision. She had made it long before the court ruling, and there was no going back for Nate. Meanwhile, Claire's life was beginning to shift in ways I hadn't imagined. Her courage through this whole process was something I had underestimated. At first, I worried about how she would cope with everything, how the financial strain, the public fallout, the emotional trauma would affect her. But I had underestimated her strength. Claire threw herself into her work, taking on new projects, focusing on the things that made her feel in control of her life. She had always been an intelligent, driven woman, but I had never seen her so determined. She had spent so many years tethered to a man who had constantly belittled her, telling her that she couldn't succeed without him. Now, she was proving him wrong every single day. I watched her find her footing again, both professionally and personally. She had joined a new team at work, taking on more responsibility, showing the world exactly what she was capable of. And at home, she began to rebuild in ways I hadn't expected. She started redecorating her house, making small but meaningful changes. A new coat of paint, a new arrangement of furniture, plants where they hadn't been before. It was as though she was taking back ownership of her space, of her life. It was a powerful thing to witness, but perhaps the most heartwarming part of all of this was seeing the way Claire and I began to reconnect. Our relationship, which had been strained over the years due to Nate's control over her, began to heal. We spent more time together, had long conversations over cups of tea, and began to do things we hadn't done in years. We laughed more, shared more, and found a new sense of normal. As for Nate, he found himself spiraling further into his own mess. The news stories kept coming, the whispers growing louder. His business partners started distancing themselves from him, and the once bustling network of people he had surrounded himself with began to fall away. I saw him in public once, at a coffee shop. He didn't see me, but I watched him for a moment. He was sitting alone, staring down at a coffee cup like it held the answers to everything. His face was gaunt, his eyes dull with the weight of it all. I didn't feel sorry for him. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with them. Still, I couldn't help but think about the man he had once been, the man I had welcomed into our family. The man who had made promises, who had been charming and full of potential. It was hard to reconcile that person with the man I saw now. I realized with a tinge of sadness that I had been deceived by the mask he wore. But Claire? Claire was free. And that's what mattered at the end of it all. The true justice wasn't in the court ruling or the settlement. It was in Claire's freedom, the freedom to start over, to reclaim what had been taken from her. And she had done it. She had stood up to Nate, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her own life.
It had been months since the trial, and as I stood beside Claire, watching her flourish in ways I hadn't thought possible, I realized how much we had both underestimated her strength. She had been through hell and back, but now, in the aftermath, she was emerging not just as the woman I had always known her to be, but as someone stronger, more resilient, and, most importantly, more free. Nate's name barely came up anymore. It wasn't out of avoidance or fear, it was because, for the first time, it no longer mattered. The shadows he had cast over Claire's life for so long were finally receding, and she was stepping into a light that had always been hers, just waiting for her to claim it. The wounds of the past were still there, but they weren't bleeding anymore. They had healed. She had healed. The morning after the final ruling, Claire woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't seen in years. She was no longer a woman waiting for someone else's permission to live her life. She was living it on her terms. The first thing she did after the ruling was settle into a new routine at work, taking on projects that she had previously put off, believing she wasn't capable of handling them. But now, she was unstoppable. Every meeting she walked into, she commanded respect. Her opinions were sought after, her expertise valued. The company she worked for took notice, and before long, Claire was promoted, moving into a senior role where she was given the responsibility she had always deserved. She found a new rhythm in her personal life as well. Weekends, which used to be marked by loneliness or strained visits with Nate, were now filled with activities she enjoyed, visiting friends, spending time with me, and even traveling to places she had always wanted to visit but had put off. For the first time in so long, Claire was discovering who she was outside of her marriage, and she was liking what she found. She was free to explore her passions again, to rediscover herself, without fear or doubt clouding her every decision. We spent more time together too, those simple moments that had once been rare. Coffee on a Sunday morning, long walks in the park, and talking about everything and nothing. I watched as the weight she had carried for so many years began to lift, and it filled me with pride to see her thriving again. It was as if she had been trapped in a cage, waiting for the right moment to break free. And when she did, it was with a quiet confidence that made it clear she was never going back to the life she had lived with Nate. There were no grand gestures in her healing, no dramatic declarations. It was a process, slow and steady, but with each passing day, it became clearer that Claire was reclaiming the life that had been stolen from her. Her happiness wasn't dependent on Nate, or on anyone else. It was hers, and hers alone. As for Nate, his life continued its downward spiral. The bankruptcy filings, the fraud accusations, and the stories of his deceit were now a matter of public record. His attempts to rebuild his reputation were futile. The people who had once praised him now avoided him, and his business ventures faltered under the weight of the lies he had told. Nate was a man without friends, without allies. His past actions had burned every bridge, and no amount of pleading could change that. Claire had not just won in court, she had won in life. She had stood up for herself when no one else would, and in doing so, she had broken the cycle of control that Nate had tried to impose on her. I could see it in her eyes, the way she now moved through life with ease and confidence. She had found peace, not just from the past, but with herself. The final act of justice wasn't the settlement or the court's decision, it was Claire's ability to move on. To live her life, unburdened and free from the shadows of the man who had once tried to break her. That was the real victory. It was the quiet justice that doesn't come from a courtroom, but from within. We were sitting in the garden one afternoon, just the two of us, the air warm and full of the smell of blooming flowers. Claire looked at me, her expression calm but content. "I never thought I'd get here," she said softly, her gaze resting on the flowers in front of us. I never thought I'd get out of that situation. I thought I was stuck forever. You were never stuck, Claire, I replied, my voice thick with emotion. You just needed to find the strength to walk away. And now look at you. Look at where you are. She smiled, a true, genuine smile that lit up her face. I guess I just needed to remember who I was. And who I could be without him. In that moment, I realized that the real resolution, the real closure, wasn't the end of the trial or Nate's downfall. It was Claire's transformation. She had taken back control of her life, not through revenge, but through strength, courage, and self-awareness. And that was far more powerful than anything Nate could have ever done to her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the garden, I felt a deep sense of peace. The past was behind us. Claire had broken free. And now, it was her future that mattered. The cycle had ended. And a new chapter was just beginning. Author's note. This story highlights the quiet power of self-discovery and the importance of standing up for oneself in the face of manipulation. Justice doesn't always come with loud battles or explosive confrontations. It often comes in the form of reclaiming your own power. Claire's journey was about more than just legal victories. It was about healing, finding strength in vulnerability, and building a future on her own terms. In the end, true freedom comes from within, and no one can take that away.